Hello and welcome to this short video on the cerebral cortex. My name is Professor Phil Newton, and what I hope you're able to do by the end of this short video is just to be able to describe the basic structure and function of the cerebral cortex and some of the major subregions of it. Before we get into the detail, we just have to cover some basic anatomical terms. This is an image we're going to see a lot in this video. It shows the outer surface of the brain covering the four main lobes of the brain. We'll get into the terminology for those in a few moments, but we just have to cover the terminology for the lumps and bumps on the outer surface of the brain, the outer surface, the cortical surface. A ridge, if you like, a sticky up bit of the cortical surface is called a gyrus. The grooves in between the gyri are called a sulcus, a plural which is sulci or sulci. Simple way to remember that is sulcus is down. When we're down, we might be sulking. That was a simple memory tool that was advised to me many years ago, and it served me well. Sulcus, sulk being down. Give you a couple of examples of these. The central sulcus is here, the dark black line. That separates the parietal cortex in yellow and the frontal cortex in blue. I'll just show you an animation of where the central sulcus is. It's a really important landmark when navigating the cortical structures of the brain. You can see it highlighted there in red. Separating the temporal cortex from the other two cortical regions is the lateral sulcus, also known as the Sylvian fissure. Again, I'll just pause a second. You can watch the animation through. Lateral sulcus is a deep groove separating the temporal, parietal, and frontal cortices. Tucked underneath that groove is the insular cortex. Again, I'll pause a second. Insular is actually quite a large cortical area because it's folded in to the lateral sulcus. It's very difficult to see on the outer surface of the brain. Okay, on to the four major cortical regions then: the parietal cortex, the frontal cortex, the temporal cortex, and the occipital cortex. I'm going to briefly cover the functions of these four main cortical regions. Now, each of them is worthy of many hours of video all by itself, so we're just going to give a very simple summary. One of the main things that the occipital cortex does, in fact, the primary thing that it does, is it's responsible for visual processing. So visual information comes in through the visual system and ends up in the back of the brain there in the occipital cortex, where it is processed. Auditory information through the ears ends up on the superior part of the temporal cortex there, the upper part of the temporal cortex. It is processed in what's called the primary auditory cortex up there. So one of the main functions then of these cortical regions is the processing of this primary sensory information. The other main functions of the cortical regions can be summed up in their response to incoming sensory information, whether that incoming information is external or internal. Very simply, you've got the parietal cortex. When sensory information comes in, what the parietal cortex does is it tells us where that sensory information is coming from. You expand upon that a little bit more. The parietal cortex, in technical terms, is responsible for attending to stimuli. Very basically, where is the information coming from? The anterior parietal cortex, which we've covered in another video, is responsible very specifically for localizing the body location of incoming sensory stimuli. So, for example, there's a region of the anterior parietal cortex that's responsible for processing sensory information from your hands, or a different region responsible for processing sensory information from your face. The posterior, the rear part of the parietal cortex, is a little more complex. It integrates sensory information. So it takes some of that visual, some of the auditory, and some of the other sensory information. It puts it all together in a sensory whole and then feeds that information on to the temporal and frontal cortices. The posterior parietal cortex is also really important for attention, for deciding what to pay attention to, following guidance from the frontal cortex, and then for focusing that attention in the appropriate way. Damage to the parietal cortex is quite conceptually complicated. One of the most best described symptoms of damage to the parietal cortex, particularly the posterior parietal cortex, is a syndrome that we call neglect, where an individual neglects incoming sensory information. Normally, damage to the parietal cortex happens only on one side, and so the neglect is then expressed only on one side of the sensory field. So damage to the right posterior parietal cortex will result in the neglect of incoming sensory information from the left-hand side, even though the visual pathways will be intact. We'll cover that in more detail elsewhere, but it's a simple term to remember. Damage to the posterior parietal cortex results in sensory neglect. On then to the temporal cortex. When we're processing incoming sensory information, simple summary of what the temporal cortex does is it tells us what that incoming information is. Superior temporal lobe we talked about earlier, calls the primary auditory cortex for processing auditory information. The medial temporal lobe, is the region which is responsible for identifying the nature of stimuli, very simply telling us what something is. There's lots of subcortical structures that are important for this, in particular the hippocampus and then other regions of what we're going to call the limbic system that we'll talk about elsewhere. These also convey important information about our experience with particular sensory information, but ultimately these all result in the temporal cortex telling us what some incoming sensory information is. Where have we seen it before? Damage to the temporal cortex is a simple way of understanding what the temporal cortex does. It can result in what we call agnosia. This is a problem with knowing what something is. So you might be presented, say, with a set of keys, and a patient with agnosia will not be able to tell you what the keys are. They might still be able to use the keys, they can still pick them up, but they just can't actually identify what they are. The frontal cortex then, possibly every neuroscientist's favorite part of the brain, is responsible for deciding what to do about incoming sensory information. It's really complex, the frontal cortex. It does lots of really very human things. It's responsible for those real higher order cognitive functions that we think of as being really quite human. There's a summary of them we call executive function. That's a catch-all term that includes things like long-term planning, withholding inappropriate behaviors, judgment, and personality. If a person's personality suddenly changes, or a person has had, say, a stroke or some other trauma to the brain, and their personality changes, then there's a good chance that the frontal cortex is involved. Most of these behaviors that we're talking about here under executive function refer to the anterior part of the frontal cortex, called the prefrontal cortex. It's behind the eyes and it tucks up underneath the eye sockets as well. The posterior part of the frontal cortex we've covered in another video. That's responsible for planning and executing voluntary movements. There's the primary motor cortex located right up against the central sulcus, and then some regions just anterior to that, the premotor area and the supplementary motor area, responsible for planning and organizing motor commands before they get sent down the cortical spinal tract. Okay, so that's a really simple summary of what those major cortical regions do. And apologies to anyone with a more detailed background in neuroscience. That was a very, very simple summary of what those cortical regions do. It's simple enough to be useful, but obviously it is a gross oversimplification of the complex function of many of these regions. Now, we're not going to have time or space in this short video to go through the detail of what the other cortical regions do. I'm just going to highlight a key anatomical map of the cortex, which is useful for helping us break down these cortical regions into more discrete functional areas. And that's called the Brodmann map, or the map of the Brodmann areas. It's a very old map. It was first mapped in 1909 by a person called Corbinian Brodmann. And basically what Brodmann did was it looked at sections through the cortex and identified areas that had histologically similar features and areas that had histologically different features. It turns out that histology mapped quite closely onto the function of those different regions, and so we still use this map today. It's a map of 52 regions. Some of them are subdivided because they didn't quite survive the update from histology into function, but more or less the 52 regions first mapped by Brodmann are the ones that we still use. This image shows you the basic location of those 52 regions. If I just take a second to turn this into a pointer, here are some regions we've already talked about. Here is the primary somatosensory cortex here, Brodmann areas 1, 2, and 3, that's responsible for locating where incoming sensory information is coming from in the body. Brodmann area 4 corresponds to the primary motor cortex. Show you a couple of other examples. The primary visual cortex, I'll just let this play through for a second. This is part of the occipital cortex, and it corresponds to Brodmann area 17. I'm going to give you an example here of a region of the temporal cortex called the fusiform face area. This is a very discrete region that allows us to recognize faces, faces being a very important part of how humans communicate with each other and how societies are organized, by recognizing each other by our faces. The fusiform face area, although it is a discrete region, it doesn't map neatly onto a Brodmann area. It's part of Brodmann area 37. Okay, we'll go back to some other Brodmann areas in other videos. We're now just going to talk a little bit about the cell biology of the cortex, the way that it's structured at the cellular level. Well, what we're going to talk about is neocortex. The cortex, the cerebral cortex, can be broken down as neocortex and allocortex. 90% of this is neocortex, and all of the regions that we've talked about so far are the neocortex. So that's what we're going to talk about. Cortex is organized in the horizontal plane into layers and in the vertical plane into columns, and both of them are really important for understanding both the structure and the function and the organization of the cortex. We're going to start with the cortical layers. Very simply, there are 6 neocortical layers. The 6 layers are defined according to the most common cell type in that layer. We talk about the 6 layers as being internal and external. The external layers, starting with layer 1, are the layers that are closest to the skull. The internal layers are the ones that are closest to the interior of the brain. We're going to start our journey around these 5 layers by considering layer number 5. This is called the internal pyramidal layer because it's very densely populated by pyramidal neurons. Pyramidal neurons so called because their cell body is triangular or pyramidal in shape. The pyramidal cells from layer 5 project out of the cortex down to various different subcortical regions. The pyramidal cells from the primary motor cortex, for example, go on to form the corticospinal tract. The pyramidal cells in other cortical regions project onto the basal ganglia, down into other subcortical regions, and they are primarily the cortex's means with communicating with other regions of the brain. The pyramidal layer, internal pyramidal layer, layer 5, is the primary output layer of the cortex. The feedback then into the cortex from these regions comes through the thalamus into layer 4. Layer 4 is called the internal granular layer because of its appearance. It contains large numbers of very small neurons, that are stellate neurons or granular neurons. This granular nature of these cells and the large number of them being very small gives the name the internal granular layer. As I said, this is the primary input layer for the cortex from other subcortical regions, from other regions of the brain. This information that comes into this layer, as I said, comes through the thalamus, and this is really important. Almost all sensory and other information that comes into the cortex from regions that are non-cortical or subcortical comes through the thalamus, where it's filtered and organized. And we've talked about that in a different video. This same basic arrangement of output and input is repeated in layers 2 and 3. These are now external, so we've got the external pyramidal layer. It contains also large numbers of pyramidal neurons, slightly smaller than those in layer 5. These project, though, to other cortical regions, so they don't go down the corticospinal tract or to the basal ganglia or to the red nucleus or to the brainstem. They simply go on to other cortical regions. There is again this feedback back to the cortex, and this time it's coming into the external granular layer. So back into a granular layer, but a thinner one comprising layer number 2. Okay, the top layer, the outermost layer of the cortex, is called the molecular layer. This is very basically where the apical dendrites of the pyramidal cells in layers 3 and 5 might be found. There's not many cell bodies in layer 1. It's mostly the apical dendrites of these neurons. Now, these neurons have dendrites that extend laterally throughout layer 5 and layer 3. They also, the primary dendrite that we're interested in here is the apical dendrite that extends up into layer number 1. Finally, then we've got layer number 6, and this is called the multiform layer because it contains lots of different neuronal cell types and other cell types. It's got some stellate cells, it's got some pyramidal cells, and some other neuronal cell types. The multiform layer projects primarily down to the thalamus. So this is the cortex's relay back to the thalamus. And remember that incoming information that comes from these subcortical regions goes through the thalamus before it ends up in layer 4. So that's the layers. We're now going to move on to talk about the vertical arrangement of the cortex. Cortex is broken up into what we call columns. These are basically the functional subunits of the cortex. Within each column, we've got the pyramidal cells in layers 5 and 3 with their outputs to the subcortical and the cortical regions, and then the feedback loops into the granular cell layers in layers 4 and layer 2, coming via the thalamus with the cortex itself, then looping out to the thalamus from the multiform layer, layer 6. This basic functional subunit of the cortex, the column, was first described many, many years ago, back in the 1950s, particularly in the primary visual cortex, where it was observed that distinct spatial areas of the primary visual cortex responded to distinct visual stimuli. This basic idea then of a functional subunit being a column has been extended over other regions of the cortex. It's not fully accepted, but it's certain that in particular regions, the visual cortex being the best characterized, there are these functional subunits. Across the entire cortex, there's probably several million, if not billion, of these cortical columns, and they can range in size from a few hundred micrometers, possibly even a millimeter, down to maybe 50 to 80 micrometers. Maybe that the smallest mini columns only have 80 to 100 neurons in them, and the biggest columns may have many, many more than that. But this is the basic understanding of how the cortex works. It's arranged into these basic functional subunits, of which there are at least millions, if not more. The final thing we just need to mention then is some of the modulation of these cortical columns and the basic modulation of the cortical function itself. Lots of this comes through monoamine neurons, which again we've covered in the neurotransmitter video and in other videos where we talk about things like serotonin, dopamine, and noradrenaline. These are the basic monoamines, and these are neurotransmitters whose cell bodies are located in discrete, normally deep brain regions, for example, the raphe nuclei, the ventral tegmental area, the locus coeruleus, and that they project all throughout the cortex, and they basically perform a modulatory function, turning up or down the volume on some of the synapses within those cortical layers. This is how they have their functions on things like mood, motivation, stimulation, arousal, and so on. Okay, that's basically it for our whistle-stop tour of the cortex. A brief summary: there are four main cortical regions: occipital, parietal, temporal, and frontal. We've also talked about the insular cortex. Some people talk about the limbic system as a limbic cortex, but these are the four main regions for the purposes of this short video. What they very, very basically do is identify, integrate, and respond to stimuli. The cortex is really where lots of our higher order cognition happens. It has a 6-layer horizontal structure, and we can break that down using Brodmann maps into at least 52 discrete cortical regions. There's also then a columnar vertical structure, and we think about this as being the basic functional unit of the cerebral cortex. Well, again, as always, all the images are open source from Wikimedia Commons. This is some of the image credits or all the image credits. If you've got any questions about the contents of this video, please do send me an email. That's my email address right there. I'll see you in another video. Bye-bye.